session. Also, thanks very much for joining the Ally user group. We've had about 300 people that have signed up today, which has been a tremendous success. So I'm very, very excited to get this started. So today's session will be mostly focused on providing a high-level overview of what Ally is, what it does, what some of the problems are that it's trying to address. I know that some of you might have already seen this, but most of you on the call haven't been properly introduced yet. So that's what we'll use the bulk of today's time for. At the end of the presentation, I'll also be talking a little bit about some of the next user group activities that we'll be doing and how you can participate in that and how you can help influence the direction and the sort of the future of the product. So as we have a fair number of people on this call, let's feel free to post questions in chat. We've got some people from the Ally team that have joined this call that will be answering questions as we go along. And then hopefully at the end of the presentation, we should have some time for more questions as well. So with that, I'll get started. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Let me just check what all of those responses are. Okay, that looks like a lot of yeses, perfect. Okay, so today I'll be first of all introducing you into Ally and sort of what some of the problems are that it tries to help with, how it works, how it integrates into the learning management system, and I'll be talking a little bit about sort of roadmap and timing and availability as well. So traditionally, so Blackboard Ally is a product that focuses on trying to make course content more accessible, and so traditionally, when you look at pretty much all of the systems that instructors and teachers use today, the accessibility conversation is usually limited to how accessible those systems are or how accessible those platforms are. And once it gets to the user-generated content or the course content, that's which is the content that the people using the system put into it and share through it, that content is usually treated as a black box with regards to accessibility. And ultimately, that's really the content that most of the students are after. It's also where the majority of the accessibility issues exist today. So so that's kind of where Blackboard Ally comes in. That's it really tries to look at some of that course content, try to make that more accessible, and try to open up that sort of black box of the user-generated content, and try to make that leap towards also looking at the content that our instructors produce and our students use. So accessibility of digital course content or course content is actually quite a hot topic right now. There's a number of problems that have existed in this area for quite a long time, and they're sort of being accelerated in many cases by some of the legal threats around this. And so in terms of some of those long-standing problems, there's some problems that the institution is faced with. There's some problems that the instructor is currently faced with, and there's some problems that the students are currently faced with. And so in terms of problems that the institution is faced with, first of all, it tends to be extremely difficult as an institution to understand how you're doing with regards of the accessibility of your content, and that's because there's tons of content out there. There's new content being created all the time. There's a wide range of people that are creating content. There's a wide variety in types of content. So because of that quantity problem, almost, it tends to be very difficult to get good insight into how you're doing, other than maybe some manual spot checking. But that's not quite the same, and that's sort of because it's very difficult to get that insight into how you're doing. That makes a number of other things very difficult. So it makes it difficult to understand. Well, first of all, just how you're doing in general, how things are evolving, where some of the problems are, who you need to target as an institution to help improve things, and in many cases, it makes it difficult to make a case for accessibility in general at your institution. And so most of the institutions that we talk to, they have something along the lines of an alternative media lab or a disability services department where students, once they've once they've disclosed their disability to the institution, where they can put in requests for things to be made available to them in a particular alternative accessible format. And that tends to be a very that sort of remediation process tends to be a very manual process, a very sort of labor intensive, very time consuming process.
Sorry to interrupt, but we lost your screen share.
Okay, let me try again. Sorry for that. Okay, can you see it again?
Yeah, we're good now.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So their remediation process tends to be a very manual, time-consuming, sort of labor-intensive process. So we can take, and I'm sure there's a lot of you on the call that have been through that process, and you sort of understand how manual and painful that can be. And because of how manual that process is in nature, on the one hand, it can take a long time for things to be turned around and for things to be sent over to the student in the format that they requested. Which doesn't really work well for the student, but on the other hand, it's a very time-consuming, very sort of expensive process on the institution's end as well. And then obviously the sort of big elephant in the room around this, there's some legal requirements around the accessibility of course content, which sometimes, especially in the US these days, ends up with institutions being sued around this. We are seeing some sort of legislative changes that are either in progress or have already happened all around the world within this area. There's some changes that the US is going through. There's some changes that the UK has just gone through. There's some changes in Europe. There's changes basically all around the world, and this is part of why it's becoming a very hot topic. I don't like to use the legal threat as a stick very much, but it's definitely one of the reasons why a lot of institutions are paying attention right now. In terms of problems that the instructors face with, we've talked to a large number of instructors about this, and generally, I think it's fair to say that we've seen a very significant awareness issue. There appears to be a lack of awareness in terms of what the instructor is expected to do around the accessibility of their course content. There also appears to be a lack of understanding on how accessibility can affect students and how many people or how many students it actually does affect. And then there's also a perceived lack of guidance on how the instructor can improve the accessibility of their content. And when I sort of talk to institutions about this, sometimes they're a little annoyed about that because they're already organizing dedicated training around this. They're already sorry, I think I cut out there. Can you hear me again? Okay, thank you. So they're already organizing training around this. They're already sort of dedicating sections of their website to how they can create how more accessible content can be created. One of the big challenges there is the sort of disconnect between the instructor's workflow and some of the systems that they use to create and share their course content, and the sort of things that are available already. And so that disconnect is part of the reason why there appears to be a very significant lack of awareness and lack of understanding, as well as that sort of perceived lack of guidance. In terms of problems that the student is faced with, which is obviously most important, as I said, they usually have to put in these sort of explicit requests for things to be made available to them in a particular alternative accessible format. That can take a long time for them to receive because of the manual nature of the remediation workflow, which doesn't really work well with their course flow. Can cause them to, often it will take. Do you lose my slides again? No. Sorry. So often it will take days for something to be turned around. It can even take weeks in certain cases, which can cause the student to fall behind. And one thing that we think is a very significant problem around all of this is that the existing workflow or the traditional workflow tends to exclude quite a few students. It excludes students that aren't aware of this workflow. It excludes students that deliberately choose not to disclose their disability to the institution. And we've seen some research that suggests that there's an increasing number of students that deliberately choose not to disclose their disabilities. But then it also excludes students that that don't have a recognized disability, and we sort of strongly believe that there's a lot of things that can be done around the accessibility of content that will ultimately make it sort of benefit all students. That will really, and that's really where accessibility starts to touch on the usability and the quality of the materials, and that's something that we think is very important. That's sort of the core business of the university, and we definitely don't want that to be excluded from the picture. So this is that's sort of the quality and usability benefits that accessibility can bring is something that we also try to push very, very heavily through the product. So that's a little bit of background as to where Blackboard Ally comes in, some of the problems that it's trying to help with, and so the way in which we see Ally is not as we don't see it as a separate platform or a separate system that people go to, but as something that very seamlessly integrates into systems that people already use. So instead of them having to be aware of yet another system that they then have to go to, we actually want to bring our accessibility features into the systems that they already use and use that as a way to increase visibility, increase awareness, and so on. And so obviously the learning management system is a very obvious starting point there. It's a significant player with regards to course content. It contains a lot of course content. Students access it frequently to get to their course content. So that's currently what we are entirely focused on, is providing the very close and seamless integration with the learning management system. I'm very excited about the fact that we are committed to providing Ally to as many students as possible, including institutions that are using non-Blackboard products. We will be making an integration available against Instructure Canvas. We'll be making one available against sort of standalone Moodle. We'll be making one available against Desire to Learn. I think that's really important. I think first of all, it's just the right thing to do. It kind of confirms in my mind that we do want to be sort of a leader with regards to accessibility in general. And I think there's some practical benefits there as well. If you have a department within your institution that's using a different LMS, you can still take a consolidated approach around this. You can still do consolidated reporting. If you're working together with other institutions, maybe in a statewide system, that are using different LMSs, you can still take a consolidated approach, do consolidated reporting, and so on. So there's some very practical benefits to taking that approach as well. Over time, we do see potential for lots of other types of integrations. For example, things like web conferencing systems, things like content management systems, for example, WordPress or Drupal, things like content collaboration systems such as let's say like Box or Google Drive, things like library systems, publisher systems. So there's lots of potential that we see there for those other types of integrations where we think we can provide a very useful Ally integration. Having said that, that is sort of more future looking. Our focus right now is entirely on, first of all, providing that very close and seamless learning management system integration. So a little bit more about how it works and what it does. And so the way in which it works is that, so as an instructor, and this is for the LMS integration specifically, as an instructor, you go into your course and you add some course content in the LMS. And this all uses the native LMS flows. We very deliberately don't change any of that. So we don't sort of add any extra steps in there, or we don't interrupt the process. So in many ways, we try to shoot for an integration that's as invisible as possible, while still making sure that all of our features are there for those that need them. So having said that, so as an instructor, you go in, you add your course content, and at that point, Ally will automatically pick up on it in the background. It'll do a number of things to it in the background. So first of all, it'll check what type of content is this. Is this like a PDF, or is it a Word document? Is it a presentation? Is it an image? Is it HTML? Is it something else? And then depending on the type of content that it is, it'll and note that this all happens automatically in the background. So as an instructor or as an institution, you don't have to manually trigger anything. So this happens automatically. So the first thing that it'll run through is an automated accessibility checklist, and that accessibility checklist will check for common accessibility issues within the type of content that was just added. And so that can be anything from, so there's like high-level checks, for example, is this a scanned document, down to very fine-grained checks. For example, contrast checks at the individual character level. So there's a whole range of checks that we sort of run through. Our checklist is based on WCAG 2.0 AA, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, but for those that aren't, is an international accessibility standard for web content. And then we also sort of add a few things on top of that really try to get at the sort of quality and usability of the materials a little bit more. So we run the content through these automated accessibility checklist. The next thing that we do is we've also developed a set of machine learning algorithms, and what they try to do is they try to essentially extract some of the semantic information that is visually present to our eye, but might not be there in a machine readable way. And what that means is that it'll do things like try to identify what the reading order is, where the headings are, what the heading structure is, where paragraphs are, lists are, tables are, mathematical formulas are, and so on. And then, so these two processes happen automatically in the background. At this point, this is where we get into the sort of user-facing features of Ally. We'll start off with the student-facing ones. And so from a student point of view, the first thing that we'll do is based on the accessibility checklist, based on those machine learning algorithms, we will automatically generate a number of more accessible alternatives for the student. And so our sort of primary format that we produce there is something that we call semantic HTML. So where we'll do things like take the sort of heading structure that we've identified, convert those into semantic HTML heading tags, take the tables that we've identified, convert those into semantic HTML tables, take the lists and convert those into semantic HTML lists, take the mathematical formulas, convert those to MathML, and so on. And so there's a number of different things that we do there in order to generate that semantic HTML version. That's a version that tends to work well with screen readers, so it makes it a little bit more navigable, a little bit more readable. So for example, it allows them to pull up the heading structure, which especially for longer documents makes it much easier to sort of move through the document. And then it's also a format that works well on mobile devices. And then we use the sort of semantic HTML version as a basis to generate a number of other alternative accessible formats, things like an EPUB version of the content, an audio version of the content, an electronic braille version of the content, and so on. And then so running through this process doesn't take very long. So so usually within about I guess a minute or so of the original being added, we'll have run through this process, and we'll have run through the checklist, the algorithms, and then we'll take all of those alternative accessible versions, and then we'll make them available to the student as well as the instructor within the learning management system. And this will become clearer once we get into the demo in a few minutes. But the approach that we take there is that we never replace the instructor's original. We always keep the instructor's original in place as the default version. But every time that the instructor's original can be accessed, we'll provide a way in which you can get to the alternative accessible versions as well within that same context. So that's the first part of what we do. That's really about what can we do in an automated way to provide more accessible alternatives to the students, so that they at least have something that they can get started with, rather than having to first put in the request and wait for that to be delivered. One thing that I'll point out is that these algorithms, they can't fix everything. There's certain things that we're not able to do. So for example, if there's any images that are used inside of a document, then coming up with quality alternative descriptions for those images is not something that we can do. At that point, we can only sort of point it out. But there are a number of different things that can be done in an automated way. So that's the first part of what Ally does. Second part of what it does is, based on the checklist, again, based on those algorithms, we also provide a feedback loop back to the instructor, where within the context of the LMS, we actually present them with some feedback on how accessible their content is, as well as some very detailed guidance on how they can fix some of those identified accessibility issues. And that instructor feedback flow has a number of different goals, but it's ultimately a training goal, and it's a way to automate some of the dissemination of these of this training and this documentation. And so first of all, I mean, there's the short-term goal in that if the instructor engages in this workflow, they'll generate a higher quality and more accessible original, which will be beneficial to the student immediately, will also allow us to generate higher quality alternative accessible formats. So that's kind of the short-term goal, but the real goal is a long-term goal, is a sustainability goal almost, is to try and embed some of these best practices into the instructor's workflow, try and change their behavior a little bit over time, so that next time around when they're preparing some new course content, they can actually make some of these things part of their workflow rather than having to sort of fix and revisit after the fact. So that's the second part of what Ally does. The last part of what it does is based on based on doing this across everything within your LMS, including everything that was there before Ally was enabled, we also provide a feedback loop back to the institution where we'll generate a full institutional report that will sort of give you some very detailed insight and understanding of how you're doing with regards to the accessibility of your course content at the institutional level. So it'll tell you sort of how accessible your content is on average, how things are evolving over time. You can sort of look at what how many content items are involved, what the most problematic or what the most common issues are, what the most problematic courses are. So there's a whole range of insight that it provides that will sort of try to shed some light onto how you're doing and how things are evolving, where the problems are, and so on. So the next thing I'll do, so I'll jump into a demo. I know that there's a few of you on the line that have already seen the Instructure Canvas demo. Today I'll be doing a Blackboard Learn demo. Okay, and so just to avoid technical issues, I'm going to do a clickable prototype, but we can do a more detailed dive through it if at any point in time if you want. So so I'm going to use Blackboard Learn 9.1 for this. The first thing I'll do is I'll sign in as an instructor, and we're going to go into one of the courses that I'm teaching, and then going to go into and we're going to add some course content. For example, into one of the folders within the course. Oh yes. Okay, hold on. Where did you lose me? Okay. Just a second. Apologies for this. Okay, can you see it again? All right, perfect. Okay, so backing off a little bit here. So I'm going to first sign in as an instructor, and then going to go into one of the courses that I'm teaching, and then I'm going to, now that I'm in one of those courses, I'm going to add some new course content. And so, for example, this should be pretty consistent across the different native LMS tools, but in this particular example, I'll do it as within a folder within the course. And so first of all, let's add 2 items. And so the first one I'm going to add is something that already exists within the course. Okay, add this one. Okay, so I'll add this one first. The next thing I'm going to do is I'll add something that isn't in the course yet. I'll just upload something from my computer. Okay, and so we'll add that one in as well. So as you can see, all of this just uses the native LMS flows. We didn't change any of that. You can see some of the things that we start to add into the interface, but the basic workflow very much remains the same. So now that this has happened, I'm going to, and so now that this content's been added, this is the point at which Ally will automatically pick up on it in the background. We'll run it through we'll sort of first of all check what type of content is this. We'll run it through the accessibility checklist. We'll run it through the machine learning algorithms. We'll generate those alternative accessible versions. We'll prepare some of that instructor feedback, and we'll add it to the institutional report. So that's what's happening in the background. The first thing I wanted to sort of go into now that we've added this content is look at the student experience around this and some of those alternative accessible formats that we generate. So the first thing I'll do is I'll sign in as a student in the same course. I'll go to the same folder, and then as I said before, the sort of approach that we take with the alternative accessible formats is that we always keep the instructor's original in place as the default. So this is the one that we're seeing over here is the version that the instructor uploaded. That's the default version. But every time that that version can be accessed anywhere, we'll provide a way in which they can get to the accessible version. So there's a little context menu there that allows them to get to the accessible versions, which will then sort of list all of the versions that are available for the student to access. Before we look at some of those versions, let's have a look at the original that I uploaded. And so this is the original that I uploaded, which is an untagged PDF. It's a very problematic example. It's a pretty common example as well. So this is so it's untagged, so it doesn't have any of the semantic information present. It's got a 2-column layout, which doesn't read well on a screen reader. It's got a pretty advanced heading structure, but that information isn't there. It's pretty long in general. There's a fair amount of complexity in this as well. So there's some figures in there. There's a lot of tables in there. There's a fair amount of mathematical formulas in there. And as I said, it's just pretty long in general. So this is a good example, and I know there's some people on the call that have gone through the process of remediating these types of documents. This is the type of document that takes a long time to remediate, takes a long time to sort of manually go through and sort of turn into a more accessible version and into some of those alternative formats. So this is kind of what we start off with for this example. If we then go to some of the accessible versions, so you'll see that we've generated an HTML version, which as I said is kind of our main version. Then there's an audio version, electronic braille version, EPUB version, and so on. So if we have a look at the HTML version, so this is the HTML version that it generates. So you'll see that it sort of picked up on that 2-column layout, incorporated that into the conversion. You'll see that it sort of recognized a lot of those headings, converted that, sort of incorporated that into the conversion. And you'll see some of the paragraphs that I picked up on. And then as I scroll through this, you'll see some of the tables that we recognized, which we then converted into semantic HTML tables, including some of the table headers. And then as I scroll through this, you'll see some of the mathematical formulas that were in there that we recognized and converted into MathML. And then as I continue to scroll through this, you'll see a lot of that additional complexity come in. And so this is kind of what I meant with, we try to do as much as we can in an automated way to provide a much more accessible alternative to the student pretty much immediately. So that's really what we're shooting for here. And then some of the other, as I said, a lot of the other versions are based on this version. So the audio version, we use an integration with something called Acapella, which will generate a very natural speech, and will also incorporate some of the semantic information that we've extracted into the speech, so that it's, as a listener, it's easier to understand when you're listening to a title, or like when you're going through a table, for example. So there's the audio version, and then the electronic braille version is very much the same content, very much the same structure as the HTML version. Is just a different different tool, a different medium in which you can open that content. Come on. Go back to page 1. So as you can see, very much the sort of same content, the same structure, just a different set of accessibility features that you can use, that you can tap into. And then there's also an EPUB. There's also an electronic braille version, which is a version that you can run through an electronic embosser. So that's kind of the alternative accessible versions at a very high level. The next thing I wanted to show is the instructor feedback, and go through some of that. So in order to do that, I'll sign out, sort of go back in as the instructor again, and then go into the same course. And I'll go into the same folder for this example. So in terms of the instructor feedback, we take an approach that's in many ways very similar to what we do with the alternative accessible versions, in that every time that the original is available, we'll provide an indicator of how accessible that content item is. And then as an instructor, you can sort of choose to engage with that. And then as you engage with that, that'll bring up our our feedback, our guidance, which will tell you sort of how accessible the item is, what the issue are, what the issue is, sorry, or what some of the issues are, and what can be done to fix it. And in doing this, we try to, because we understand that a lot of the documentation that's out there today can be very technical in nature, can be hard to get into. So we try to put a lot of different layers of documentation in there so that we can make it very approachable for an instructor, while also understanding sort of why it matters, how it can impact people. So there will be documentation in there, things, and we always try to stress some of the benefits that it brings to all students, so to really try to get the instructor to engage. So these are, for example, some of the benefits. And then there's some, if they actually want to go through this, there's some very detailed guidance that they can work through. You can then pick the software that they're using, and it will give them some steps. And then at the end of it, they can either, so in this example, they can provide something, they can sort of provide a new version at the end of it, which will then upload, which will and then at that point we'll sort of reevaluate the content, we'll rescore it, we might be able to give some additional feedback, we'll also regenerate our alternative accessible versions, and so on. And so you'll see that my score has gone up a little bit. It's not perfect yet, there's additional issues. So that's one example of a flow. Another example is, so if you look at the image that we've uploaded, as you noticed when we uploaded it, we didn't provide an alternative description, so it's sort of highlighting that it currently doesn't have an alternative description. And again, there's lots of layers of sort of documentation here where we sort of explain them why this is important. We sort of tell them how they can write a good description, and so there's a lot of content in there. And in this particular example, they actually don't have to upload a new version. They can just provide something directly into Ally, which will then make its way through into the LMS, or they could also indicate that it's decorative, in which case it doesn't need an alternative description. And then at the end of it, you can sort of see the score go up. And so these are just two examples of some of the many different instructor feedback flows that are inside of Ally. So that's kind of the sort of instructor feedback at a very high level. Again, it's something that's very consistently present throughout all of the native LMS tools. So anytime that any content's being used, they'll get that indicator, they'll get that guidance, they'll get that feedback, and that's always there for them, no matter when. So that's the second part of what Ally does. The last part that I wanted to show is the institutional report. So for that, this is an administrator functionality. So for that, I'll sign in as an administrator, go into the administration space, and then from there you can launch the accessibility report. And so the report is actually a standard LTI tool, and it sort of allows you to look at things either by semester, by month, by academic year, and so for each of these different sort of time periods, you can then select one, and you can then drill down into that, and so it'll tell you how many courses are involved, how many content items are involved, how accessible the content is with and without Ally, what the sort of main accessibility issues are that were identified. And we sort of split things up into what's severe, what's major, what's minor, and then there's also and then for each of those issues, I should have said that, for each of those issues, you can also sort of click through and get a list of all of the courses that have that issue, get a list of all of the items within those courses that have that issue. So you can really go all the way up from the sort of very high level overview down to the individual course level or the individual content item level. Second part of this institutional report is a courses-specific view, where you can get a list of all of the individual courses at your institution. For each of those courses, you can then click through and essentially get an individual course report, where we'll tell you sort of how many items are in the course, how accessible the course is with and without Ally, what the issues are that were identified within the course. And then again, same thing for each of those issues. You can click through and you can get some additional information about the issue, get a list of all of the items within the course that have that issue, and so on. So that's kind of what the institutional report does. So it really tries to provide some very detailed insight into how you're doing as an institution, tries to help you understand where the problems are, how things are evolving, as well as what you can potentially do yourself as an institution to help sort of further improve things. And this is also something that will be always entirely up to date, so you don't have to sort of manually rerun a report every so often. So you will always have that information at the sort of pretty much in an up-to-date way. So that's the third part of what Ally does. So going back to the presentation. Okay. Can you still see my screen, Simon?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so just summarizing, so Ally essentially has three main feature areas. There's the alternative accessible versions that we automatically generate and make available to students as well as instructors within the context of the LMS. There's the instructor feedback, where we provide, again, within the context of the LMS, provide feedback to instructors about how accessible their content is, as well as detailed guidance on how they can fix some of those issues. And then there's the institutional reporting, where we provide that institution-wide overview of how you're doing with regards to the accessibility of your course content. A much better way, or the way in which I like to think about this problem, is accessibility of course content is very much a spectrum or a continuum. It's not just a yes or no. And as an institution, you sort of land at a certain point on that spectrum. And for many institutions, it's pretty far down. There are institutions that are doing a lot better. And so essentially everything that Ally tries to do essentially attempts to move you up on the spectrum as much as possible. And so that's where, first of all, the automated generation of those alternative accessible versions comes in, which will help you move up on that spectrum quite a bit. And then in order to help close the remaining gap, that's where you do need some engagement from the instructor, from the institution, as well as the institution. And so that's where, first of all, the instructor feedback then comes in, which gives you a fairly automated way in which you can sort of disseminate some of that documentation to the instructors and make that a little bit more manageable. And so that will help close the gap a little bit more. And then the institutional report is essentially there to oversee that entire process, give you a sense of where you are on the accessibility spectrum, as well as what you can do as an institution yourself to help further improve things like organize additional training, and it will help you identify who to target for that training, things like license-specific software, bringing in external help, and so on. But that's kind of how all of Ally's features work together to try and move you up on that accessibility spectrum as much as possible. All right. Wanted to talk a little bit about roadmap and general availability. So the plan that we're operating on right now will have us officially launch Ally. So we'll be going out of beta in April of this year. So in a few months' time. At that point, it will be available for Blackboard Learn 9.1. So it will, which is a Q2 release of 2017 for Blackboard Learn. So in order to use the Ally features with your Blackboard Learn instance, you will have to upgrade to that 9.1 Q2 release. We will also be officially launching it for Moodle Rooms as well as Canvas in April. Following that, in June, it'll be available for in Spanish as well. So we'll be making it available for Spanish-speaking countries. And then between September and December, we'll be doing a very big sort of internationalization push where we'll be making it available in like Dutch, French, Danish, Portuguese, and so on. And the what's worth noting is that we'll be doing some international hosting as well. So Ally is a fully cloud-based application hosted in Amazon Web Services. When we officially launch in April, we will be hosting from the US North Virginia data center, as well as the Frankfurt, Germany data center, as well as the Sydney data center. Going forward, we'll be adding some additional data centers to that, including Singapore and São Paulo in Brazil. So that's kind of what the plan looks for these three LMSs. In the second half of 2017, so on the back of the...
Nicholas,
Yep.
Can you clarify whether it will be self-hosted Learn, SaaS, or managed hosting?
All of those.
Okay, all of those.
Yeah, and so if you're a SaaS Learn institution, then you don't really have to do anything. Then you're automatically upgraded to the latest. For the other cases, it does require an upgrade, but it will be available for all of those.
Okay, then I apologize for some confusion in the chat.
No problem. And then going forward, we also, on the back of the Moodle Rooms integration, we also want to make it available to sort of core Moodle or standalone Moodle, and we've been supplying some patches already. So we don't have an exact launch date for that yet. We're working with an institution that's helping us verify that integration, and so we're hoping to launch it in the second half of, or we will be launching it in the second half of 2017, hopefully fairly soon. And then with regards to the D2L or Brightspace integration, we're working very actively with D2L on that right now, trying to get an exact timeline. There's a few small features that need to be added to core D2L for the Ally integration to fully work, and so we're in very active conversation with them to try and settle on that timeline as soon as possible. So as soon as there's any news about that, we'll definitely post this to the Ally user group. That's a little bit about roadmap. Wanted to say a little bit about the Ally user group. So this is really the sort of official kickoff of the user group. This is where we get some of these interactions going. The next thing that will be happening will be an opportunity for you to participate in some UX research work, and that research work will be this will probably be a survey that we send out. Your participation is optional, so you don't have to feel obliged to participate, but you'll receive a link to that survey, and we'll essentially try to find out more information about how you think Ally should integrate with some of the resources that already exist. So things like is there any existing documentation that you already have that you'd like Ally to integrate with in some sort of way or to surface in some sort of way? How would you prefer the workflow to be in terms of instructors reaching out for help when they're unable to fix an accessibility issue in their content? How do you want students to reach out if they have questions or problems with a particular alternative accessible format? So that's really what those questions will really be focused on, and that will then move on into, and we'll then summarize all of those findings, and we'll move on into, we'll definitely share that back with the group, and then we'll move on into doing some design work around that. In late February, we'll be organizing some usability testing on the instructor feedback flows, and so that will, we're still deciding whether that'll be whether those will be supervised sort of synchronous sessions where we schedule some time slots and you can sign up for one of those time slots, or whether those will be unsupervised, where we actually send out a link with some instructions on how to accomplish a workflow, and then there's a way to do it sort of asynchronously at your own pace. So we're still debating that, but those two will be coming your way. Again, as I said, participation is optional, but if you do, then we can incorporate your feedback and the results of your testing in sort of our future design and development work. One of the other things that we'll be doing very soon is we'll be setting up an official Ally user group space, which will be a space where we can share some of these items with you, but it'll also be a space where you can talk to your peers about this. So you'll be able to talk to other people about Ally or even accessibility in general. There'll also be a space where you can suggest new IDs or vote on other people's IDs. So it'll be another place where you can sort of engage with us as well as the community that we're starting to form around this. So I'm very excited to see some of the things that will be coming out of that. And that space will also, some of those IDs, some of that feedback that's sort of provided through that space will also be the most important thing that we use for future roadmap planning and so on. So that's definitely very important with regards to the future and the priorities that we set for this product. All right, and that's the last thing I had. So I'll stop here and I'll see if there's any other questions or things that we want to discuss as a group. Let me just stop the screen sharing.
There's a few questions, or there were a few questions around costs and existing licenses. Is that something you want to talk about in this presentation?
Yeah, so there will be Okay, these are all good questions. So there will be a separate license fee for Ally because we'll sort of be processing over this extra content, and we want to make sure that the service is sustainable. I'm just putting my email address in chat right now. If you want some additional information about the pricing, feel free to reach out to me, and then we can then I can share that. The Does Ally add captions and transcripts for video files? So currently we don't do very much with regards to audio and video files. We've primarily been focused on text-based documents up until now. Obviously, audio and video are very important in all of this, so it's very high up on our roadmap. We sort of have a four-step plan for sort of improving the audio and video support within Ally. And so the first step will be to really extend the accessibility checklist to so that we can catch a lot of those accessibility issues within audio and video and flag those within the application. The second part will be providing some tools within the instructor feedback flow that will make it easier for an instructor to fix some of those issues. So, for example, provide a transcript or provide captioning and so on. The third thing that we'll do is look at some potential third-party integration. So, for example, if your institution has a license for a third-party captioning provider already, then we'll look at whether we can sort of set up a workflow where, as an instructor, you can then request for your item to be captioned, which will probably then go through some sort of institutional workflow. But that's the sort of third-party integration is the third thing we want to look at. And then the last thing we'll look at is what we can do in an automated way that's of high enough quality to be useful to the student, and that's a little more sort of future looking, I guess. I mean, things like the YouTube API, for example, aren't of high enough quality to expose to students. So we're having some very early conversations there, for example, with the IBM Watson team on what we can do there in an automated way, but that's obviously a little further. So with regards to listening to an audio file, so I will include a link to the audio file for the document that we used in this in my follow-up, where I also share the link to the recording. I don't really have a way in which I can feed the output from my microphone back into my from my speakers back into my microphone, but I'll include the link to that audio file if that's okay. And just scrolling up there a little bit. So I'll include the samples that we went through in the demo as well. So the PDF, the HTML, the EPUB, and so on. Simon, were there any other questions that we missed?
I don't think so. I answered a few questions in the chat, and I think you answered a few other ones during your presentation.
So definitely, so the session tomorrow is essentially going to be the same session. So so you definitely shouldn't feel like you need to attend that one. It's basically a rerun to accommodate for some of the time zone differences. All right, perfect. Then I think, unless there's any other questions, I'll stay on for a few more minutes in case any other questions come up. But thank you very much for attending this. If you have any, if anything comes up after this, feel free to send me an email if you have any questions, and then we'll be following up very soon with the first sort of UX research exercise. Yes, Catherine, there will be a recording of this. So I've recorded this session. I'll publish this to YouTube, and then I'll send out the link to the user group as well. All right, perfect. Thanks, everyone. Have a really nice day.